Art can be a bridge between people. Hey everyone, I'm Jason Smith, originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Today's guest is Josh Selig, an American television producer and director. He's won 12 Emmys, 10 of which were Daytime Emmy Awards for his work on Sesame Street. I practically grew up on Sesame Street. That's really exciting for me. And he is the founder and president of China Bridge Content. Welcome to the Bridge to China podcast, Josh.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here.
We have similar names for our products. I think that's very interesting. We chose our name because we wanted people to have an accurate understanding that China is a peopled place with people that are very much like folks in the United States. We had a guest, Cyrus Jansen, who said something a couple of years ago that really resonates with me about why we do what we do. And he said, I want people to know, in America to know, that somewhere in China right now, there's a grandfather holding his granddaughter's hand and walking her to school. So, you founded your company in 1999. Could you tell us a little bit about what is the purpose of your company, what do you do, and what does it have to do with China?
Sure. Well, actually, the company that I founded in 1999 was a company called Little Airplane Productions, and actually sold that company in 2017, and then launched this new company in 2021. So China Bridge Content is only been 4 years old, and it has a very specific focus on China. And I think the reason is that at my old company, we co-produced two very popular shows. One was called Super Wings, which we co-produced with Alpha in Guangzhou and Kika in Germany. And then we co-produced Peking Duckling with Yu Yang in Beijing. That one was for Disney Junior. And I realized that the challenge with co-productions, and I guess commerce in general between the US and China, is that there are a shortage of bridges of all kinds. You have the different time zone, different language, different culture. It really makes it hard, and as a result, there isn't a lot of interaction between the two sides. So the purpose of this company, China Bridge, is to help Western folks who want to work with China to do so, and to help Chinese folks who want to work with the West to do so.
Well, it sounds like you're looking for professionals, so anyone who's watching might want to reach out to you. Like I mentioned, I grew up on Sesame Street. I think a lot of people in my generation, many generations, grew up on Sesame Street. When mom was busy or dad was busy, I was in front of the TV watching Sesame Street, learning, letters and empathy. So, it was very much responsible for my love of fellow man. It developed in me the philosophy as a young child, to really relate to other people. I mean, I think that's the whole purpose of Oscar the Grouch, actually. The whole purpose is to say, hey, someone's down on their luck, but we should care for them. They're a part of our community. So could you tell us a little bit, how are empathy and compassion woven into your storytelling? Is there a process? Is it about assembling the right team? And could you tell us a single story where you participated in the weaving of this fabric?
Sure. I mean, I left Sesame Street in 1999. I haven't been at Sesame Street for over 25 years, but it really shaped my perspective on young kids, on entertainment, on educational content in so many ways. It was a great place to learn. So to answer your question, Sesame Street is a curriculum-based show. The curriculum is very robust. It has a lot of goals, including a lot of goals about emotions, empathy, these kinds of things. So our jobs as writers on Sesame Street is to incorporate these goals in a way that's very unique and very funny and very playful and entertaining. So, it really is a great place to learn how to simultaneously entertain and elevate young kids. And I feel like those lessons have carried on to my other shows and other projects since then. In terms of an example, one of my jobs at Sesame Street was as a international producer. So they would send me to different countries to help set up different co-productions. So the one that I feel the most proud of was the Israeli-Palestinian Sesame Street. So I lived in Jerusalem for a year, working between the Palestinians in Ramallah and the Israelis in Tel Aviv. We developed the Palestinian characters, we trained puppeteers, We had experts from the Muppets come over. We had experts from Sesame Street join us, curriculum people from all sides. It was really an extraordinary year. And I think that was, for me, the most important sort of integration of all the things I learned because the stakes were so high. So it wasn't just like we want to make kids laugh and teach them counting. We were dealing with very sensitive cultural issues. You know, we had this area of the street where both the Palestinian puppets and the Israeli puppets would meet, and they would talk about things like hummus, they would talk about family, they would talk about their professions. And it was really this very kind of idyllic world where the two sides were coming together and building positive relationships. So that was an example, I think, of a story where I had to really use what I learned at Sesame Street, along with all my colleagues, to make a show that really, I think, had some pretty big impact.
You know, you mentioned you mentioned 1999 twice now. So, what happened where you decided to go out on your own?
So after the Israeli-Palestinian show, I really had a lot of original ideas. So I made a transition. So I was still working part-time at Sesame Street, doing various things, writing, making short films, doing work at International. But I opened up my own shop on the side called Little Airplane Productions. And I was actually using that name for short films anyway. So I already set up the company as a filmmaker, including films for Sesame. But I decided to really pitch to start my own shows. So I had a one-room office in Tribeca. I had a colleague who worked with me at Sesame International. Her name was Lori Scher, now Lori Sherman. And she and I set that place up, and we pitched and were able to make a show called Ubi, which was made for Noggin. This was a puppet show. And it did very well, and it got started as shorts. It became a full season, and that really launched my career as a creator showrunner, which was a little different than the Sesame Street experience, where I was sort of one piece of a very large puzzle that already sort of existed. So with that, we just focused on preschool, and my whole career really has been in that preschool space. I think what was unique about Little Airplane is we didn't really want to do anything else. We really wanted to be specialists in that demographic. And we noticed at the time you had networks like Nick Jr. had just been launched, Disney Jr. had just been launched. And our attitude was, well, if there are networks that care this much about the demographic, they're going to need suppliers who care equally about this age group. So that was sort of the goal, and I think we did quite well with it. You know, we created a bunch of shows that did extremely well, like The Wonder Pets and Small Potatoes and Third and Bird, and I feel very proud of those years.
Well, could you, when you're focused on kids, because I used to be a kindergarten teacher, so not quite pre, but I spent a lot of time with 5 and 6 year olds. When you're focused on kids who are 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. What are some of the ideas in your head about the kind of curriculum that you're building and the kind of ideas that you want to infuse in the next generation of people? Because essentially that's what you're doing. You're getting a hold of the next generation of people before everyone else does, and you're sort of setting the tone. What kind of tone did you set?
It's a really good question. The curriculum really comes down to early childhood experts who work with me and with other companies on their original shows. So that person is always working in parallel with my creative ideas. So for example, when we first created the Wonder Pets, I knew I wanted these 3 characters. I knew I wanted them to be animals from a classroom. And I wanted them to not individually be powerful or strong enough to overcome the problems. They really needed one another. And so I described the creative vision of the show to the director of research that we were working with, and she suggested teamwork as the curriculum goal. So that became the foundation for songs like What's Gonna Work, Teamwork, and it really helped to guide the shaping of the episodes. So the curriculum is sort of evolves with the creative idea, at least on the shows that I work on. This is sort of unique to America, to be honest. In Europe or Asia, they don't tend to work as often with curriculum folks as we do. So in terms of where those values come from, I think they come from my own childhood. For me, I have very rich, happy memories of being a preschooler, and I have a 4-year-old now, and it's like I remember that year. I remember how we experienced things at that age in a very visceral way. It's very fresh in my mind. I feel like I can remember my preschool years better than my middle school years. Somehow those years for me are very relevant and very powerful. And I still to this date think that humans peak at age 4. It's just at a time when they're so creative, they are so loving, they are so fun, they are so imaginative with their play. They have such positive personalities, they're really just great people, and I feel like something happens to us starting at around kindergarten where we start to become socialized in a way that makes us very self-conscious and makes us question ourselves, and our confidence starts to get a little wobbly. Some make it through that, some never do, but there's something about a group of 4-year-olds that's really quite free, which I really respect.
I have another question now that you mentioned you have a 4-year-old. Is it boy or girl?
Girl.
So when you take your little girl to be entertained for those periods of time that you've allotted for visual entertainment, does she watch your content or does she watch just what's out there?
She definitely doesn't like my content, definitely, and that was a painful realization. What she really loves is Peppa Pig, and she loves Bluey, and I happen to think those are great shows, and she chose them. So she's a big YouTube consumer. So she controls the iPad. She knows how to find what she likes. So I feel very happy that she, on her own, arrived at content that I think is very beautifully made. In fact, she loves Peppa so much that we just took a trip for New Year's down to Orlando to Peppa Pig's theme park, which was definitely a peak experience for her. And I learned so much on that trip. Even though I've been doing this kind of work my whole life, seeing her interact with Peppa and her family and those rides, the joy, the friendship that she felt for them was so powerful. And, she was listening to their accents and she was like, this is the real Peppa because I know that voice. She really was sensitive to kind of the nuances of it all. And it really made me appreciate, that company that makes that and that show. And again, I'm really happy she's gravitating towards the good stuff.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting to have your own, captive audience to experiment on to some extent, see how they react to all kinds of content. I want to talk about you and your experience with China, and I'm sure that our fans, because they're China focused, they want to know about your experience with China. And I understand that you have a long history with China. So could you tell us about when was your first trip to China? Let's just start with why did you first go to China? What was the intention? What was the purpose?
I was actually still working at Sesame Workshop, and they sent me along with a team to work with the Chinese team that was developing and producing a show called Jima J, which was a Chinese-U.S. co-production of Sesame Street. My specific job was to train the writing team. So my first trip was to Shanghai. We stayed in the Garden Hotel, and we had, I think it was about 10 days of intense meetings with the writing team and the head writer, who was a very famous Chinese poet. And it really changed my life, that trip. I had such a great time, and I just developed a love for China. There's no other word for it on that trip. And then I just went back whenever I could for any reason whatsoever. And it sort of became part of my career kind of organically. It wasn't like I intended that to happen. But, to this day, when I get off the plane, I feel something really great when I land in China. And I couldn't really quantify it, but it hasn't gone away in over 25 years.
So 25 years ago, could you tell us what was Shanghai like? I wasn't here 25 years ago. The first time I came to China was 13 years ago. What was Shanghai like 25 years ago versus what does it look like to you today?
Well, back then you still had a lot of old neighborhoods, and some of them had actually were sort of slated for demolition. So you'd have whole areas where you couldn't go to because they were being knocked down to put in skyscrapers. So I think the biggest difference is it just wasn't as modern. It wasn't as high tech. It was on its way there, but the airport was completely not bilingual. You had to really, you felt like you were in a very far away country. Now, when you're in Shanghai, you feel like you're in a very international city. You can get by with English or any other language. Um, the people, I don't feel a lot of difference in terms of the warmth, the welcoming quality. But I would say in terms of the professional lives, the Shanghainese are extremely sophisticated. It's a remarkable city. It really incorporates so many cultures. The only city that I have ever felt so much diversity in is probably New Orleans, but New Orleans doesn't have the sort of commercial element that Shanghai does. But they both have this blending of history and architecture and different kinds of food. So I find Shanghai amazing. So the biggest difference is it just felt like a very old-fashioned city, and now it feels like a very modern city.
Yeah, my own feeling, having traveled around China extensively, is Shanghai is perhaps almost to me like so international at this point that it seems almost not like China, because the rest of China has still got like a little older, a little more traditionally Chinese cultured, and Shanghai in a lot of ways just seems like a metropolitan city that you would find anywhere to me. I wanted to ask you though about expectations, because I think a lot of people in America, they have a loaded concept of what China is like, but then they come to China and then it's very different. Before you arrived 25 years ago for your first trip to China, what did you think China was going to be like? And then how were you surprised that it may have been the same or different from your expectations?
You know, when I was in college and shortly thereafter, I used to take a lot of backpacker trips, and I would buy the Lonely Planet books to sort of guide me through, whatever, Malaysia, Indonesia. And I learned on those trips that it really doesn't matter how much you prepare. When you get there, you feel the place. And that's not captured in any articles or books or travelogues. So I really didn't go to China with a lot of preconceptions. I was just kind of wide open to see what the experience would be. As a kid who grew up in New York, we ate a lot of Chinese food. I had, spent time in Chinatown. That was sort of as much as I knew about China at the time. So I was wide open, and I really, as I said, I really enjoyed it.
Your work is about your recent work is about transitioning cross-cultural boundaries. You're trying to help different cultures interact. And before we get to how you do that, could you tell us a little bit about why do you think it's important? Why did you take up this task, this very challenging task?
Well, one of the reasons that I like the preschool demographic is that it's very similar all over the world. Young kids in any country mostly care about their family and their friends and their toys and the games that they play, their schools. And so there's a lot of common ground. Once kids get older, culture seeps in, pop culture seeps in, technology. So there's something about preschool that I find to be much easier to work with as a medium when it comes to anything international, because the themes they're so universal. So for me, when I did the jobs with Sesame for Israel Palestine, or I worked on the Polish show, I worked all over the world on shows. I really started to understand that there is a way to create content that travels. And this has really been the core of my work and my interest is I really don't want to make content for any one country. I really think if content is good, just like if poetry is good, it should resonate everywhere. If a film is good, it should resonate everywhere. And I find a lot of content is really sort of culturally bound in a way that limits it and limits its access into other markets. So I think if I've done something well, and I think Super Wings is a great example of this, I really have managed to partner with companies and countries and to distill what do kids like everywhere into a concept for a show, and to know how to write those episodes and design the episodes, direct the episodes so that they really resonate anywhere you go. Small Potatoes, even though that was a show that I created for the BBC, it's been dubbed very well into Portuguese. And in Brazil, they think that's a Brazilian show. There's nothing about that that pegs it to New York City or to the US. And I like that. I really like that everybody can sort of adopt these characters and consider them to be their own. So to me, there's something very satisfying about making content that's seen all over the world. And I feel very happy about that. I also think it's very difficult. Most people, including in China, really tend to focus on their domestic market. So they think only about their broadcasters, their toy companies, their educational focus. And even if the show does amazingly well within mainland China, it often has trouble getting out. It's seen as being too culturally specific. So even if it's dubbed very well, it still just doesn't resonate. So with a show like Super Wings, we were able to make that show, and it was as popular, in Europe as it is in China, and it was hugely popular here as well. The toys sold extremely well in the U.S. So to me, having an IP, a show that is really truly global, is a very specific part of our industry, and I don't think there are that many companies or individuals that really focus on it. In some ways, it's seen as being very hard, but I think people just get preoccupied with their own market. So if you're in France, you're thinking about the French. If you're in China, you're thinking about the Chinese.
Wow. How is that done? Like you mentioned cultural specificity. When I'm thinking about a 4-year-old, I don't think about a lot of specificity. When I think of culture, I don't know. I think of maybe architectural monuments that we would identify with a place. So how do you avoid cultural specificity, and what are one or two examples of things that children would identify with everywhere, like maybe falling down or being embarrassed, or what is something that translates everywhere?
Well, I think it's not a coincidence that shows like Peppa Pig and Bluey do well everywhere. Peppa's from the UK, Bluey's from Australia, because they're really about family. They're about the way families interact, the way families travel, the way families talk at dinner time. And so to me, family is quite a universal. And I think those two shows travel much better than most shows. I think, when you have shows, for example, there are quite a few shows in China that focus on the zodiac signs, which are very important in China. Those shows don't tend to travel as well. Zodiac has very different meaning in different countries. I think there's a lot of shows that are very nationalistic, that are sort of openly, espousing the virtues of this country over that country. I've never gotten involved with those shows. They seem very limiting to me. And so I tend to like things that have that kind of universality. It doesn't mean that there's nothing specific about them. It's almost like the culture that they represent is the show's culture. So the show becomes its own universe. So the Small Potatoes is its own universe. It really doesn't exist anywhere on the planet, and therefore it can exist everywhere on the planet. If it was set, in an apartment next to the Eiffel Tower, it would be clearly that these potatoes were from France. And then people, that's not a bad thing, but it's also not necessarily a universal thing to live near the Eiffel Tower. So I always try to be very vague about things like where they're from, and what school they went to, and even what language they speak, because ultimately these shows get dubbed into dozens of languages.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Even if growing up in California, if they were to show, like, I don't know, the Statue of Liberty, I wouldn't have identified with that as a child because I've never seen it when I was a child. But, oftentimes you do see those kinds of things in American cartoons and media. Could we go back to China, for example? You mentioned Shanghai. What other cities in China have you visited?
I've been all around. I've been to Harbin, Shenyang. I go very often to Guangzhou and Shenzhen. I go very often to Beijing, Changsha. I like a lot. Chengdu. I love Chengdu. I love the food in Chengdu probably the most of anywhere else in China. Yeah, I've been around, but I haven't really been to the smaller cities, the third, fourth tier cities, and I would like to go one day.
I think that's where a lot of people's interest is turning. People are very because everyone knows that China's urban areas are become hyper modern, and I think the concern, the interest is, well, how is the rural area of China developing? When you think about, you mentioned Chengdu as your favorite food. I'm assuming you mean hot pot.
Everything I ate in Chengdu, I loved. I mean, the noodles on the street were the best noodles on the street I ever had. So I didn't eat one bad mouthful in Chengdu.
Wow. Okay. So which visually, in terms of seeing a skyline or a city or the experience of people moving around, which city did you enjoy the most?
I think I really have developed a great love for Shanghai and Guangzhou. I think those are probably the two favorite cities for me.
Where have you not been, other than specifically, like, or generally third and fourth tier cities? Is there a specific location, a city, a region of China that you haven't been that you would really like to see or experience?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a funny side story. So, my wife is from Harbin originally, and I had this idea that I wanted to propose to her at the far end of the Great Wall of China, and I did all this research about what that is like, and it goes right to the ocean, and I thought this is a
Hmm.
very beautiful spot for a proposal. And then for logistic reasons, it became completely impossible to propose in that spot. So it ended up being in Beijing.
I'd be curious
But I've always wanted to go.
to hear your story about why logistically it became impossible. I was just there. I've been here for 13 years. I was just at the place where the Great Wall goes into the ocean for the first time like a month ago. And it was like, wow,
Mm,
okay, I guess this is where it ends. So why were you
yeah,
unable to go? I think it's Qinghuangdao, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, it had to do with her work schedule and
Oh.
flights and train. It couldn't happen for reasons that were incredibly frustrating at the time because it was supposed to be a surprise on top of all of it. So it didn't play out.
You can't be like, well, we really have to go here. Why? Why is it
Yeah.
so important that we go here right now? You mentioned she's from Harbin, right? So, have you been to the Ice Festival, which is the world's largest annual ice festival?
Yes, I have been to that ice festival. It's incredibly beautiful and incredibly cold.
It is incredibly cold. I remember taking my hand out of my jacket to use my phone, and I was like, bad idea.
Yeah, yeah, that's
It
true.
was difficult to take pictures. Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about U.S. ideas of intercultural understanding and China's ideas because they seem dissimilar to me. We have this idea in the U.S. I don't know how it is really now growing up, but when I was a kid, we were taught tolerance, and I've always kind of found this suspect because to tolerate implies there's a need to tolerate. Like that doesn't seem positive to me. But I've noticed in China that there's a lot of ethnic minorities here, 55 ethnic minorities, 56 ethnicities. That's how China counts it. But they have an idea of intercultural celebration, of appreciation. People like to go to the Miao community and dress up as the Miao people, and the Miao people and the tourists go together and take photos, and it's like a happy intercultural exchange. What kind of philosophy do you use when you are bridging otherness and differences in your own work?
Well, I think because that otherness doesn't really impact the preschoolers as much as it does the older kids, teenagers, adults. They tend to be very open-minded about other kids, and I see this in my daughter's play and at her school, and I don't. It's not really a factor, to be honest. It's kind of woven into their lives, and I'd like to think it's kind of woven into my shows in that it's not handled in kind of a self-conscious way, like we need to have a person of color here and a person in a wheelchair there. So it doesn't happen in a formal way. It happens in a very organic way, I think the way it happens in kids' real lives. And certainly there are shows and even countries where there isn't very good representation. But I think my shows have always been pretty inclusive in that way, but not in a formal way. I think a spontaneous way.
Well, in terms of your own personal experience of traveling between the United States and China extensively, could you talk about what do you think, what kind of misconceptions do Americans have about China and maybe Chinese have about America that you would wish people would reconsider?
I just feel, unfortunately, that most Americans don't have an accurate impression of China. I do think that, that brief period when TikTok went down in the US and Redbook became popular, that really, in many ways, was great for China because it really showed people the daily lives of Chinese people, which is, for the most part, a really good life. I mean, there's never in history been a situation where in 50 years, almost a billion people have been lifted out of poverty. This is just such an extraordinary statistic. And that's not really often seen or appreciated internationally. I don't exactly know why, um, uh, but it's not. And I think most people still have this perception or misperception that they're going to get off the plane, they're going to be they're going to see bicycles riding down the streets of Beijing and people wearing like Mao shirts. They just haven't kept up with China. But China has moved forward in so many ways. And, I've never felt anything but freedom when I'm there. And, I write a lot, I talk a lot. I love America, I love China. I just don't feel the things that people seem to worry about when it comes to going to China. I mean, you're living there, so you know more than I do, but I've always felt very comfortable. And there are some things that I really like more than New York that relate to safety. So especially when you have a child, you're very aware of crime, and you're aware of drug abuse, and you're aware of rats in the park and this kind of thing. And I just don't see that stuff in China. I'm really amazed at how clean the cities are and how well kept they are, and the lack of street crime or I think there are no handguns or virtually no handguns and very little recreational drug use. Things like that really aren't problems there. And to me, that creates a very relaxing environment. I remember in Guangzhou one night, I'd gone running and I ended up outside, and it was this big plaza, and it was just filled with families, and they were like, had these like glow in the dark things and balloons, and it was such a free feeling at night. And I was thinking, can I think of a place in New York where families congregate outside at night without any self-consciousness, like Times Square? Probably not. Washington Square? I don't think so. So they're here. There's an awareness of your safety that I don't feel when I'm in China.
Yeah, I mean that's my own personal experience. Actually, one of the reasons I'm so spoiled about living in China that this one thing is why I would feel uncomfortable moving back, because I remember being living in San Francisco and feeling, it's a beautiful city. I'm not complaining. I loved it there. I had a great time living there for about 10 years, and I enjoyed every day. And every day that I woke up in San Francisco, I felt appreciative that I got to live there because it's expensive. And but now that I've lived in China for so long, I think I had this heightened sense of self-awareness, an awareness of where I was and what was going on around me all the time. And I didn't even realize it until I'd lived in China long enough to, I don't have my guard up ever. Like, what's happened? And could I deal with that again? And the reality is, I think it's too high anxiety for me at this point. I want to talk about your other products. Because Peking duckling obviously is a reference to Chinese culture. So how did you incorporate Chinese elements into, your cartoons or your products, which are trying to be universal for all these 4-year-olds who have this better universal idea of humanity than we do as adults? Could you tell us a little bit about Peking duckling and what kind of vehicles did you use? How did you incorporate Chinese elements?
Sure. So that show was a co-production between my old studio and a company called Yu Young in Beijing. So it was truly co-developed by both companies. So we knew we wanted an animal-based show because we wanted it to travel. We didn't want there to be people all over the place. We knew we wanted a comedy, a 2D comedy. So we had elements in place, but there was a lot missing, including a title. And actually, I was having lunch with the two guys from Yu Young, James Changu and Eddie Beaufan, and we were thinking about, what do we call this show? And we were eating Peking duck, and I think it was me said, what if we just call it King Duckling? And we all thought that was really a funny play on words, and that became the English name. The Chinese name is Do Xiao Ya, which is a sort of silly duck kind of a meaning. And it just kind of that moment, sort of the rest of it unfolded. And then we put together a beautiful Bible. We brought that to Disney Junior. At the time, they were really looking to do something with China because they had just opened their Shanghai Disneyland. They wanted to show reciprocity, win-win, works for both sides. So they picked up the show. It was the first time they'd picked up a Chinese show. And then every script, every design was done between both countries. So we were on the phone or video calls constantly, a lot of flights back and forth. And it was really an extraordinary experience. And I think in terms of how we incorporated culture, we definitely had certain episodes that involved obvious cultural things. They turned the Great Wall into a water slide in one episode. So we would do some things like that, but the truth is, as I said before, we tried not to anchor it anywhere. So they kind of lived in this place called Hilly Hole, which is this very surreal place. But some of the side characters, the color palette, a lot of these things were very Chinese, but they also worked everywhere. So, this is really where the hard part is how to blend these things in an organic way. And I think where most shows fail is they try to adapt a show after the fact. They try to say, oh, we developed a show, we want to sell it to China, let's add some bamboo or something like that. And it doesn't work. It doesn't make it a Chinese show, but people try these kind of strategies. And I always say you can't retrofit a Chinese show into the US or a US show into China. You have to co-develop it to make it truly an international show.
I like that you're always talking. Every question I ask you, these are our partners, and this is how we work together. It seems like everything that you create is with a team, is with other people, is sharing ideas. I really like that. This is where this kind of work is coming from. Multiple people, multiple perspectives. You talk about experts that you bring in for different kinds of values and ideas for children. Real quick before we move to the next question, I'm just curious: have you been to the Disneyland in Shanghai?
I have not. Nope.
Well, you have a daughter. You're going to have an opportunity. It's a lovely theme park. I used to work for Disney briefly, and we could go to the parks for free periodically. And I went there 3 times right when it opened. It's a very lovely place. You've worked with the Smithsonian, which is the museum par excellence in the United States, to create characters. Could you tell us about what kind of characters you created?
Yeah, sure. So they reached out a few years ago. They wanted to develop a character that would be very family friendly for their National Museum of Asian Art. So we went into sort of a deep dive with their team to talk about what kind of character would work best. I can't really tell you too much because we're now entering a new phase with that and everything's sort of hush hush. But that first phase was to develop who the character was, the backstory, and now the next phase of it will be the design, what it'll look like, how it'll move. But the idea was to warm up the environment and to do so in a way that reflected the values of that museum. It was kind of a new job, but it actually has led to other opportunities with museums. So we've done some work with the JC Museum in Guangzhou, which is an animation museum. I helped out an artist just a few weeks ago in Flushing. She had her first solo show. So we're getting involved in ways that make us a bridge, not just in animation, but a sort of a cultural bridge in other ways. And I find that very interesting. It's not something I anticipated happening, but I can see that there's a need for bridges in every area of life, not just in animation. But we're working on two new shows at the moment, which I'd love to mention. Um,
Please.
one of them, which I just started right before the holidays. It's the second season of an amazing show. It's called Hey Toma. So this is a show that comes from a studio in Hangzhou. They're called You Know. It's run by a really creative guy named Li Zhang, and he completed already, without my involvement, season one, which is distributed by Wildbrain, which is a very big Canadian company, and they really wanted to upgrade the content for season two. So I came on board, and we're now working on the storylines and really shaping the content. And again, the goal here is to have it work in China and to have it work all over the world. So that's been a very exciting project. And the second one is a show called the C-Pops, and this is with a company in Beijing. It's called Perfect World Animation. So they have two very successful Chinese shows. One is called Cosmic Crew, one is called Rainbow Crew. They're for slightly older kids. So we partnered to do a spin-off for the preschool market, which is called the C-Pops. So this is using China pop music for the songs. It's educational, so the characters sing in every episode. They solve their problem using a song. Songs are very catchy. So I'm really excited about that one too because they're a very big company. They're known as a gaming company. They've also done feature films at Perfect World, but their shows, for whatever reason, haven't yet traveled well outside of China. So my role, my mandate here is to really help the C-Pops grow. So I took that project to MIPCOM, which is a big market in France, in October, and since then we've been meeting with potential partners to co-produce that show, and there's been a lot of really positive interest.
I wish I had children because then I would be able to show them all of this. Maybe I'll watch it myself. When you turn on the television in China, it is different from the U.S. version. You have this interactive media to choose from, like what do you want to watch? Children's cartoons or movies or TV shows, and there are all these different brands, and it's pretty easy to get to the children's section. So I'm curious now. You've written for the New York Times, China Daily, the South China Morning Post. Firstly, before I ask this question, it seems like you're involved in everything media. You've involved in dolls. You do CGI and animation cartoons. It looks like you're creating these characters for museums. You write for newspapers. It doesn't seem like there's anything in music. It doesn't seem like there's anything you don't do. By the way, I just want to point that out before moving on. But I'm curious about your writing. You recently wrote a headline. Sinophobia is un-American, and I think that this is incredibly important. This is what I do, and I was asking, could you tell us a little bit about why it's un-American? What did you point out in the article? What would you like Americans to know about this concept?
The title came from a quote from Wang Yi, who's a Chinese diplomat, and I have it up here. And he said this was after he had met with Anthony Blinken, the former Secretary of State, and he observed many people believe that the United States is suffering from an increasingly serious bout of xenophobia. So I thought that was a great line, and I do believe that there is a tendency in the U.S. to overstate certain aspects of China's rise and to feel uncomfortable or to feel threatened by it when as far as I can tell, the evidence seems to support that China wants nothing more than to go back to the days of engagement when we were working together very closely to the benefit of both of our economies. And you could argue that we are still very engaged. I mean, you can buy there are more Starbucks near my hotel in Beijing than they are near my home in Battery Park City. So, there's a lot going on commercially, but at the same time, you have, these situations where Chinese professors are feeling very uncomfortable and scrutinized for various things. There's a certain kind of suspicion, which I wrote in the article, if not checked, could easily become something very much like what McCarthyism was, where you start to just suspect your neighbor, suspect your colleague. And I really think this would be a tragedy for both countries. America and China have so much potential to cooperate, to grow together. I believe China can and is rising peacefully. I mean, people talk about, how China is building its military. You know, the U.S. has over 800 military bases around the world outside of the U.S. China has one, which is near Djibouti, which is a shipping lane area. So there's really no proof, from my perspective, that China is projecting power in the way that the US and other countries often project power. I believe China is mostly concerned with taking care of this massive population, raising the standard of living, making sure that China is never a weak country again. So I believe that both superpowers can work in tandem and balance each other in ways that can be mutually beneficial. And I used another quote in that article, which I'll read, which I think is important, and it comes from Noam Chomsky, and he said the great powers will either find a way to cooperate, to work together in confronting imminent global threats, or the future will be too grim to contemplate. And I believe that's true. I don't really think there's an alternative to China and the U.S. getting along. I think they have to. And will they compete? Of course. And I was happy to see that the recent foreign policy statement that came out of the U.S. really didn't describe China anymore as any kind of an enemy. They said they're a competitor. And fine. That, I think, is great for everybody. Healthy competition is good for everybody. So I actually, at the moment, don't feel the threat of xenophobia the way I did when I wrote that article. At the time, there seemed to be a lot of people, panicking, or there was a lot of threat inflation. Any moment the Chinese are coming to change our lives. I just don't believe that that's true. I think China actually really respects the way the U.S. is run. It respects our innovation, our industrial capability. I really think there's a lot of admiration from the Chinese side to the U.S. I don't think that's reciprocal, except among people that really have spent time in China and see what kind of country it is, and see the way it trades, the way it communicates. I mean, China is now Germany's largest trading partner. It's no longer the U.S. So China cooperates with everybody, and it seems to be going pretty well. You don't hear a lot of horror stories. So I think there's really just a lot of education that's required to get people to see China as it really is, and not as some people try to portray it.
One of the things we encourage on this show is people to people exchanges. We want more Americans in China. We want more Chinese people to go to America. You mentioned that because I'm not in the United States. I rarely go now. So you mentioned that the temperature is lower now in terms of China rhetoric. So that's positive to me that I'm hearing this from you. I hope to hear more about that from future guests as well. So would you say that generally the media and the atmosphere in America is less confrontational in the last year or so? Or how is it shaping up right now in terms of how media coverage is about China, or how people's conversations are about China?
Well, I mean, I would say since the end of COVID, there hasn't been the same preoccupation that there was with China. And this may simply be because there's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on, with Ukraine and now Venezuela. There's a lot happening. So it could be that China has sort of simply fallen off the radar temporarily. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in politics. But it seems in general that there is more of a pragmatic approach with this administration towards China, and it is more about trade and deal making rather than, constant talk about Taiwan, the future of Taiwan, which, as you know, is a sore spot for China. So I feel like in general, there aren't the same trips like when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. There's not as much happening that's really upsetting the Chinese, and I think that that's by design. I don't think that's the goal of this administration. They don't seem to want to poke the panda in the same way that the previous administration did.
I want to go back to storytelling, because everything we've talked about is about storytelling in terms of all of the different, the titling, the characters, the background, the universality of being a 4-year-old. But I'm sure that when someone like you, who is a professional storyteller, you know, sits down to watch adult movies as well. In which you're watching Terminator 17 or whichever one has come out recently, that you're thinking about the plot, the design, the story. You know, where is this going? Making predictions about where it should go, where it could have gone, in terms of what the world needs right now, because we're at a point where all of these different civilizations are coming together. We have the internet, we have instant translation. My wife has these glasses, and she can translate like one of 100 languages instantaneously just by listening. I mean, just reads it out. Like, we are at a whole new point technologically. What kind of stories do we need right now? What kind of stories should humanity be leaning into? I like to think it should be comedies, personally, because that brings joy. But this is what you do. You look at kids and you look at the future and the next generation. When you're thinking about adult movies that you and I would watch, the family movies, what direction should we be going in?
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially in light of AI. I'm a very firm believer that humans consume creative work, artwork, shows, movies, because they really want to understand themselves and their friends and their families better. They want to feel empathy for characters. They want to go on journeys with characters that show them something or explain something that they struggle with. So I believe that art is really about vulnerability. It's about imperfection. It's about our humanity. And the thing that troubles me about so much of what I see generated by AI is it has this, for me, almost a nauseating lack of humanity. It feels very fabricated. And I feel like there's something that humans, a radar that humans have, that is very tuned in to the real, very tuned in to honesty. And that moves us, whether that's in a painting or in a sculpture or in a poem. And, when stuff is trying to replicate that with technology, to me, it falls into the category of forgery. Forgery. It can trick you, trick some people, trick the eye, but it lacks all of the good things that go into making art, which is your whole life and your family's history and all the bad things that happen to you and all the good things that happen to you. It's all somehow baked in this way that is very hard to quantify, and the end result is distinctly human. It's not something that my dogs do. It's something we do, and we do it for each other. And as we do it, we learn how to do it better. And as we consume it, we learn how to consume it better. And there's something about all that human to human that I think is de-emphasized or even devalued in this era of AI, when everybody's bragging about, I made this thing in a week, and isn't it almost like good? And to me, there's something very painful about that as a goal. I happen to think that the way we are designed, including our imperfections, is quite beautiful, and it's what makes us who we are. And this has always been true historically. This is what every novel is about. And so to me, I don't think there's any success in fabrications and forgeries. To me, it's actually a little bit shameful for me as a person who creates with just my heart and my computer. And I think most artists feel that way. There's something almost sacrilege about these tools that presume to create. It's almost like saying, I beat a grandmaster at chess with my computer on my side. It's like, I didn't do anything. The computer did it. The grandmaster may have lost, but it's not because of me, And so people take credit for the results of this technology, but to me, it's a little sad. I know it's inevitable, so I'm not naive about it. I just think that in the long run, that which is created by humans for humans will always be better, because it will resonate, because it will be textured with all the things that texture us, including our shortcomings. So, that's kind of how I feel about that subject. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I like the idea that art is searching for humanity. I mean, that's, I think that's what it is doing. I mean, I think that's everyone who is trying to make a painting is trying to touch other people and have them see something in themselves that resonates with them. You mentioned traveling. I think we're going to sum this up with this is the last question. You mentioned that you used to take these books and you used to travel to Malaysia, China, all these other places. What do you see in terms of our humanity that is the same wherever you've gone?
I don't feel that that part of us changes much. I really don't. Maybe the tools and the download speeds change, but everybody I know is concerned about the same stuff they've always been concerned about. It's their family and are they doing work that they find meaningful? Are they how are they looked upon? Are they understood? These kind of things, I just think they're very timeless, and therefore the themes in art are pretty timeless, and the forms change all the time. And maybe now people like to watch very short form videos, but the ones that resonate are all about our humanity. They're not about, this tool can, project a rocket into space at, you know, whatever quantum speeds. Nobody cares. We care about our lives, and our lives are not bound up in technology, at least not yet. But who knows? Maybe they will be soon, and maybe there'll be some hybrid stuff that changes all of what I'm talking about. But I hope not. I think that evolution has designed us brilliantly, and if we're not supposed to be able to speak 100 languages, we shouldn't. And fine, we can use the goggles, but I really think there's a reason why our minds can handle a certain number of languages, etc. I don't think we are meant to do everything at once, and I don't think celebrating processing speeds is necessarily a wise use of time.
That's all the time we have. I just want to thank you for your time. I know it's a very valuable, very precious. Thank you so much for coming on our show, Josh Selig.
Thank you, Jason.